A recurring feature of the Final Fantasy VII Remake series are the men in black cloaks who lurch ominously around in key locations, unsettling everyone who encounters them. From a purely plot-driving perspective, they are there to continually remind our heroes and the player where we are heading and what our goal is, and anchor to the key plotline that might otherwise be lost amidst the world traversal minigames and side quests that make up Final Fantasy VII and Rebirth in particular. But what are they really, with respect to the lore and story? Well, first off, it's prudent to note that, unlike the Whispers, for example, they are indeed legacy elements of Final Fantasy VII and its overarching story, but where in the 1997 game they are sparsely seen throughout the game world, and only as we draw closer towards the end game and Sephiroth's true location in the Northern Crater do we actually get to see them with any consistency. And actually, what we have through the traversal of Final Fantasy VII proper is this illusory, unseen man in a black cape, as he's called, who we are pursuing but never actually see because he's always one step ahead. And so the NPCs of each location say that they saw him recently passed through, but nothing much more than that. But turning to the men in black cloaks, and for clarity here, Final Fantasy VII proper is rife with weird translations and ambiguities, and two theories prevail as to what the man in the black cloak actually is, because the true Sephiroth is in stasis at the Northern Crater. We don't actually encounter him until right at the end of the game. So many have supposed that the man in the black cloak is the Jenova clones, who we do indeed see in Remake and Rebirth, and that's very much how the remake represents it, while others, including myself, had always supposed that the man in the black cloak, who we don't see, is actually Jenova manifesting itself in the image of Sephiroth, which we know it can do. And this theory is consistent with the pursuit of Jenova as Sephiroth, which begins in the Shinra Tower and persists later at the cargo ship, for example, where we see Sephiroth appear. He drops an alien Jenova appendage as he leaves, which morphs into a Jenova boss battle, and so on. So that's the original structure of the original game, and the Black Cloaks are very ominous incidentals that we encounter much later in places like Nibelheim, the Whirlwind Maze, and the Northern Crater. In this context, much like in the newer games, they sort of shuffle about, groaning about Sephiroth, about reunion. They give us an item, and then they presumably die because they tend to disappear off the field screen once we interact with them. But what really are these entities? What is their role in the story? And how do they hint at a much speculated upon aspect of the relationship between Sephiroth and Jenova? Well, firstly, it's prudent to note that they are not actually clones in the commonly accepted sense of the word, and this is much more of a translation issue. Back in 1997, there was actually a lot of confusion about whether the hooded figures beneath the robes actually looked like Sephiroth or something. But actually, what's meant by cloning in this context is that the villainous Professor Hojo has injected these individuals with Jenova cells to test his hypothesis of the Jenova reunion theory. And the Jenova reunion theory is the hypothesis that the alien Jenova, when it is separated from itself, even at a cellular level, it will undergo genetic recall and reunite its body on a long enough timeline. And this is why we have these automatons in black cloaks marching in unison towards a single point, and they each have their own numbered tattoo indicating their subject number during Hojo's lab tests. A major plot point of Final Fantasy VII is the fact that Cloud Strife himself hosts Jenova cells, and in both the original and the remake games we have this crisis of identity, this crisis of self, where Cloud fears that he is nothing more than a puppet like these robed men. But there are a number of factors distinguishing how one ends up as a pale zombie or not, and being comparatively unscathed like Cloud Strife and Zack Fair, and it has a lot to do with physical and mental aptitude, genetics, macro exposure, and so on. And this degradation, or lack thereof, along with the genetic experimentation angle, it very much shows, in a broader sense and a thematic sense, how Final Fantasy VII had thoroughly shifted out of the arena of high fantasy and into the sci-fi and the cyberpunk sort of genres. And we see this subject matter explored elsewhere in the compilation, particularly in Crisis Core, where we have the questline of Egill and Genesis, who were sort of the precursors to the Sephiroth experiments, and weirdly actually represent cloning in a much more literal way. Now, a crucial twist to the Jenova reunion theory, which Hojo observes in the game events, is that the clones are not actually making their way towards Midgar, and attentive players here will note that Jenova is of course being hosted in the Shinra headquarters at the beginning of the game, but all of the clones are making their way north through the mountains at Nibelheim towards the northern crater, and the reason that they come to be called Sephiroth Clones is the fact that they are being drawn towards Sephiroth rather than Jenova. So a number of reasons pertain to this, the prevailing of which is that Sephiroth, while being a Jenova host himself, actually mentally overpowered the alien and thus is the root of the reunion, and indeed the puppeteer of Jenova itself, as well as these Black Cloaks, which are all doing his bidding. The means by which he achieved this overpowering of Jenova is somewhat up in the air and much speculated upon, but we know from the Nibelheim flashback that Sephiroth removes Jenova's head in the reactor chamber before he, along with Jenova's head, are flung into the life stream by Cloud Strife. And it's here that Sephiroth is said to have merged with Jenova, not in a literal sense, because Jenova's head is later discovered by the Turks and Rufus in Advent Children, but nonetheless Sephiroth supersedes this alien control and thus becomes the focus of the Jenova reunion and these clones. So the clones of Final Fantasy VII Remake do track closely with the purpose of the clones in the original game. They are principally the same, if a little more prevalent, and besides having a certain goofiness at times, where they are appearing on the beach at Costa del Sol, and a newborn clone that we see at the end of Rebirth magically acquires a black cloak out of nowhere, they are, for all intents and purposes, a driving plotline for the heroes and the player to pursue, and they represent consistently the villainous fallout of Hojo's immoral experiments, and represent the self-doubt and inner turmoil of Cloud Strife, which all leads us towards our eventual showdown with Sephiroth. So, if you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to drop a comment below, and if you enjoyed the episode and you haven't already, please consider subscribing and reading the description below to see how else you can support.